In those days, the crest was in service to the shade, protectors of Heartvale. It has been quiet in the week since the unpleasantness at the Defara estate, but we know better than to let it lull us into complacency. The captain received a visit from a local friend, and within moments ordered everyone attached to the fighting into hiding. Even Irongull and the lieutenant, though our sorceress argued fiercely. The captain and I remain in the crow's nest, surrounded by crest, waiting to see if anyone comes after us. We didn't have to wait long, as armed guards bearing DeSoto markings arrived, demanding the heads of those who slew Bacchio Defara. The captain sent them away empty-handed, with promises to take up their complaints with his lordship directly. They continue prowling around the nest, as though expecting to catch us unawares. In the meantime, word has come in of Kingswood criers calling for information on individuals involved in the Defara affair. I doubt this Lord DeSoto can be mollified, and if not, then only blood will finish this feud. More blood. The captain has received another visitor, this one cloaked, passing through our sentry posts like a ghost. Perhaps it is a new contract. I'm sure our brothers and sisters in hiding are ready to act. Soon enough, if DeSoto cannot be dissuaded from a blood feud, the crest will show him how we balance those scales. Welcome back for another episode of Errant Adventures. As always, I'm your game master and solo player, Steve Morrison. This week, we take a step back from Benn and Arid's adventures for a look at Heartvale's factions and their maneuvers in the Great Game. Find out what happens on episode 20, Time and Politics. Last episode, we spent a little bit of time with Benn and Arid, looking back on some events of their past that helped to form them into the people that they are, and to also give perspective to what they're doing as mercenaries of the Crest. We also got the opportunity to peek in on the Vidala family and see what they were up to, as they had escaped to Davenar and are seemingly trying to resurrect their old god Vargosh. This week, we're going to do something a little bit different again. And honestly, there's something that I feel like has been a little bit lacking in this season, which is this sense of scale when it comes to the factions in the city of Heartvale and that are engaged in this story that we're building throughout this season. So I did a little bit of looking around and I found a game called Worlds Without Number. And it is a game by Kevin Crawford. I was aware of Stars Without Number, and so when I came across Worlds Without Number, I thought that was cool, especially because I am not going to be using the base system for the PCs, as we've already got the Sword, the Crown, and the Unspeakable Power, but a part of the Worlds Without Number and Stars Without Number system is a faction system. Typically, the game master would create factions for their world and play out those faction turns throughout the course of a campaign. And I'm a little sad that I didn't think about this earlier in this season, but here we are. And so we are going to go ahead and do the first faction turn for this campaign. And hopefully that will give us a sense of what the various factions in Heartvale are doing, and will also give us a little bit of direction for what the next contract that the Crest takes. So because of that, and because of the situation that we have and the factions that we've interacted with so far this season, I have created 6 factions that are going to take part in this faction turn. And of course, as things go, some of these factions might fade into the background and new factions might rise, but we are going to hopefully use this to create a little bit of faction narrative drive for this season. So as such, the factions are the Crest, of course. There is a faction for the Vidala family, because I think they are growing into the sort of long-term main antagonists of this season as they're going around and doing these things to try and resurrect their god. And I think at a certain point that is going to come to a head. But as always with the various random tables and random rolls that we do, who knows what is going to happen. The other factions in the city right now are the Shade, who are currently allied with the Crest, as they have hired the Crest to do the previous job to steal the Eye of Argosh from the estate of Bacchio de Fara. And now one of the reasons I wanted to bring in this whole faction system idea is because I think at this point, after the events at the estate, it is impossible for the Crest to be operating sort of in secrecy at this point. There are enough eyes on them because of the actions taken at the estate that it is going to develop questions, and there's definitely a little bit of intrigue and danger now in the city for the Crest, more so than there was before. We've also got the Drift, which the Crest worked for in that first contract. We've got the King's Word, which is also known as the Royal Dispatch Company. And I wanted to throw them in as a faction because they are, in a way, the tastemakers and the information brokers of Heartvale, and that they are the ones that sort of control the flow of news to the populace. And so while Benn and Arid and other members of the Crest haven't necessarily come directly into contact with the King's Word, they have been present relaying information and news to the city, and I think it'll be interesting to see how they influence the events to come. The final faction is a little bit of a hybrid faction. I've labeled it the Council of 12, but what it really is it's Lord de Soto's faction of the Council of 12. And we know that Wilhelmina von Tryken, the leader of the Shade, is also a member of the Council of 12. And while she is nominally allied with the Crest because she is leading the Shade and the Crest are currently intertwined by these contracts, Lord de Soto was the uncle of Bacchio de Fara, and I think as such is going to have a little bit of a grudge because of the killing of his nephew at the grand fete at his nephew's estate. So I am putting him in as a faction because he has the weight of at least some members of the Council of 12 behind him, and he is vastly wealthy and able to influence and impact the city. So with that little introduction to our factions, why don't we just go ahead and get into this faction turn? So what the book says is every month or so, the GM should run a faction turn. I think because this is taking place in a city, it's going to move a little bit faster. The factions aren't going to need as much time to maneuver things into place because the city is, while large for a city of this era, is still a relatively small area compared to, say, a whole kingdom. At the start of every faction turn, each faction rolls 1d8 for initiative. The highest roll going first. So I'm just going to walk down the list. I'm going to roll a d8, and that'll be the initiative for each one. So the crest is going to be a 4. The shade are going to be a 1. The King's Word are a 3. The Vidala are also a 4. The Drift are a 7. And Lord DeSoto's faction is also a 1. Which is actually, I think, a good thing for us, because I think the primary tension of this faction turn is going to be what happens between the Crest and Lord DeSoto. So, because of the initiatives rolled, the Drift is going to act first. So we're just going to follow the steps of each turn in order and walk our way through this. And I haven't actually done this before, so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. The faction turn starts with earning treasure equal to half of their wealth plus a quarter of their combined force and cunning being rounded up. Force, cunning, wealth, those are stats much like steady or arcane in SCUP. And each faction has a number attached to those attributes, and they determine how good they are at achieving things throughout the course of this faction turn. So the Drift have a wealth of 3, and then their force and cunning is a 10 total, which quartered is 2.5, and the total is then rounded up. So that would be 5.5 rounded up to 6 is how many treasure the Drift gets at the start of this turn. So treasure is something that we can spend on gaining new assets, or sometimes you have to spend treasure to activate some of your assets' special abilities, and we will get into assets as we go through the turn. The next step in the faction turn is the faction must pay upkeep for any individual assets that are required, or by the cost of having too many assets for their attributes. If they can't afford this upkeep, individual assets may have their own bad consequences, while not being able to afford excess assets means that the excess assets are lost. Since we're starting out here, nobody has an excess, and I don't believe I picked any assets for any of these characters that need to have an upkeep paid. So we can skip right past there, and the faction triggers any special abilities individual assets may have, such as abilities that allow an asset to move or perform some other special benefit. So the Drift have 4 assets because they are a medium-sized faction. Basically, there are 3 sizes of factions, small, medium, and large. And of the 6 factions that we have, I've made 3 of them medium-sized and 3 of them small. The Drift have 4 assets. They have smugglers, they have a military transport, they have a worker mob, and they also have what's called interrupted logistics, which basically means that if another faction tries to move an asset that isn't stealth into the same location that the interrupted logistics asset is located, the faction trying to make that move has to pay treasure in order to ensure that their asset actually arrives in that location. Location is also a very important thing for this, so I have broken out Heartvale into the districts, of course, and I've also broken out some of the larger districts into north and south. So the districts in Heartvale are the Duxit, which is the Dux's Castle, North and South Wolfsong, or the North and South Howl. There's North and South Bright Scales, or North and South Scales. There's Tamor's Bones, which is the harbor, and then there's North and South Grasp. And then there's also the Veilward. And the Veilward is a small district that's outside of the city walls to the northwest of the city, and it heads in towards the rest of the Vale that Heartvale is a part of. And I'm going to post a map on my website for the ease of giving you some idea of what I'm talking about. So looking at special assets, the smugglers can move wealth or cunning. Military transport can bring allied assets to its location, provided they're within one's turn's movement range. The worker mob is basically a unit that you can use to attack other factions. And then, like I mentioned, the interrupted logistics is sort of there hanging out in case somebody tries to move into their space. So they don't have any special assets that trigger at this time. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the faction action. So each faction turn, each faction gets one action that they get to use in order to work towards their goal. And there are a number of different actions. So the actions are as follows. You can attack another faction. You can move an asset. You can repair an asset. You can expand your influence. You can create an asset. You can hide an asset, or you can sell an asset. Now, the Drift have a faction goal of expanding their influence. So they want to plant a base of influence at a new location. So they want to expand their influence into the city. Now remember, the Drift are these sort of free merchants and free sailors who live by this constitution out in the harbor. And they have this fleet out there where all of the sailors live, and it's a little bit more of an equitable society than the stratification that Heartvale sees. And because of that, they have a lot to offer to the city in terms of goods and trade, because they can sail off, they can go wherever they want, they can get whatever they want and bring it back. And so I think they're trying to expand their influence. And because of that, I think they are going to move an asset. So one or more assets are moved up to one turn's worth of movement each. The receiving location must not have the ability or an inclination to forbid the asset from operating there. Subtle or stealth assets ignore this limit. If an asset loses the subtle or stealth qualities while in hostile location, they must use this action to retreat to safety within one turn, or they will take half of their maximum hit points in damage at the start of the next turn, rounded up. So there is definitely some give and take and maneuvering, and it's really supposed to simulate the intensity of sort of faction maneuvering and intrigue as factions try to advance their goals. So we are going to move our smugglers into the south scales. And I think that's, again, the scales are the merchant district. And so they're moving their smugglers into the scales so they can have their smugglers bring wealth and stuff like that into the scales. So I'm just going to make a note on my little faction worksheet here that the smugglers are now in the south scales. And I don't think anybody else has an asset that is going to prevent that or create any sort of issue for the drift, moving their smugglers into place. So they are really only going to move that one asset at the moment, because I think everybody else is happy to hang out and focus on remaining in the tame. So having taken their action, the faction checks to see if it's accomplished its most recent goal. It is not, and we're not going to change that goal because I think on the next turn, we're going to try and start expanding and building some of that influence in that area. So that concludes the Drift's turn, and we are going to move on to the next faction, and it's either the Crest or the Vidala family. Now, I'm going to let the Vidala family go first, simply because they are sort of outside of the action that's going on in Heartvale. And their faction goal is to discover Vargosh's resting place, and they are going to attempt to do so. And we saw in the last episode sort of how they are starting to go about that. So first of all, they're going to earn some treasure. So their wealth is 4, plus they have a combined force and cunning of 4, which is then quartered to 1. So they're going to gain 5 treasure. The faction must pay an upkeep. They don't have any upkeeps that they need to pay at this time. And then the faction triggers any special abilities. So they have an asset called Occult Countermeasures, but that doesn't have any special abilities for this. And then they have one called Covert Transport. And this is also their base of influence, which is the sort of focus of their faction power. And that is the ship Tagaro. And it is currently sitting in the Davenar Harbor. So as a free action, once per turn, the faction can pay 1 treasure and move any cunning or wealth asset at the same location as the covert transport. The transported asset gains the stealth quality until it performs some action or is otherwise utilized by the faction. And this is located once again in Davenar. So they don't have any special abilities that need to trigger. So we are going to go ahead and take their action. So their action is going to be to create an asset. So the faction buys 1 asset at a location where they have a base of influence. They must have the minimum attribute and magic ratings necessary to buy the asset and must pay the listed cost in treasure to build it. A faction can create only 1 asset per turn. A faction can have no more assets of a particular attribute than their attribute score. Thus, a faction with a force of 3 can only have 3 force assets. If this number is exceeded, this is where the upkeep cost comes in with treasure. So they are going to create a blackmail asset. And I think this represents them gaining information from the priest that they cornered in that temple last episode. And they are gaining information from him, and maybe they're going to be able to turn that information towards others in Davenar. That costs 4 treasure. They have 5, so they are left with 1 remaining. That is their 1 asset that is built, and that is going to be located in Davenar, which is where they are located. And now they've not yet accomplished any of their goals, but they are on the way. So that is going to end their turn, and we're going to turn it over to the Crest. Now the Crest are sitting at 2 wealth. They are not super wealthy. Their cunning and force combined is 7. So that is quartered, and it's going to be, 1 and change. So that'll round up to 2, which is going to give them 4 treasure. So with 4 treasure, they might be able to buy an asset, but I think I know what they're going to do this turn. They have 2 assets. They have Informers. As a free action, once per turn, the faction can spend 1 treasure and have the informers look for stealth assets. To do so, the informers pick a faction and make a cunning versus cunning attack on them. No counterattack damage is taken if they fail. But if they succeed, all stealth assets of that faction within one move of the informers are revealed. So that's cool. And then they also have infantry, which are common foot soldiers. These represent the rank and file of the crest. I am going to go ahead and take the faction turn action of hide asset. So an action available only to factions with a cunning score of 3 or better. This action allows the faction to give one owned asset the stealth quality for every 2 treasure they spend. Assets currently in a location with another faction's base of influence can't be hidden. If the asset later loses the stealth, no refund is given. So we're going to spend 2 treasure, and we are going to give our infantry the stealthed condition. And the reason I'm doing that is because I think it makes sense that Captain Netheridge and Lieutenant Lephalia, they have sequestered Benn and Arid away. They've probably also sent away and hidden throughout the city everyone else who was at the attack on the estate, because they are trying to keep those people out of the line of sight of people like Lord De Soto. So this hiding of the infantry asset means that the crest is ready to strike back if they have to, if someone moves against them. But currently they are in damage control mode as they are trying to protect their assets. They're trying to protect the very fragile foothold that they've garnered in this city by not leaving open to attack the people who were involved in the unpleasantness at the Defara estate. So I've spent my 2 treasure, I have made my infantry stealthed, and then we are going to go ahead and end our faction turn there for the crests, as they have done what they wanted to do. The next faction up is the Kingsword. So they have a wealth of 6, and then their combined force and cunning is also a 7. So that's going to be 1 and change once again, quartered. So we'll round that up to 2, which means they get 8 treasure. The Kingsword are incredibly wealthy. They are bringing in all sorts of news and information from all around the area. And as such, they sell that information, they sell that news to the people. And that takes many forms. The Kingsword criers who call out news on the street corners are paid out of a fund from the Council of 12 and from the government. These negotiations that the Kingsword undertook to basically pass out information and news for free, quote unquote, to the people at the expense of the government. And there's an implied understanding there that if the government, if the council needs something relayed to the populace, that the Kingsword criers will help them do so. Their goal is wealth of kingdoms. And this is an interesting one. This is spend treasure equal to 4 times your faction's wealth rating on bribes and influence. This money is effectively lost, but the goal is then considered accomplished. The faction's wealth rating must increase before this goal can be selected again. So they know the truth of the adage that to make money, you have to spend money. And so that is their primary goal as a faction right now, to spread the wealth around and in so doing, gain assets and gain influence throughout the city. So they have a few different assets. They have a spy master who runs counterintelligence and formulates offensive schemes for the faction. And what that looks like is basically snuffing out any sort of competition that might come into Heartvale, trying to supplant them as the primary information source for the populace. And, information brokering can be a dangerous and sometimes violent activity. And the Royal Dispatch Company is very good at hiring oftentimes former military sergeants who are well versed in organization and logistical support of small units. And so this spy master is sort of pulling the strings and setting the pace of the Royal Dispatch Company's maneuvers in the city. They also have an asset called Useful Idiots. And these are hirelings, catpaws, or foolish idealists and other disposable minions that they can basically use to attack other factions or, do a whole variety of things. They also have a trade company. This is how they make money and they gain money. And they also have pleaders. And these are people who go to the council and argue on the Royal Dispatch Company's behalf. They are basically lobbyists. So they have all of these assets. And fortunately, they don't have any asset upkeeps that they need to spend right now. And I don't think there's any special abilities that they need to do at the moment. So I think we can go ahead and move into the faction turn. They are going to go ahead and I think also create an asset. And the asset they're going to create is a wealth asset. And I think it is going to be a manufactory. And what that does is it says once per turn as a free action, the asset's owner may roll 1d6. On a 1 point of treasure is lost. On a 2 to 5, 1 point is gained. On a 6, 2 points are gained. If treasure is lost and none is available to pay by the end of the turn, this asset is also lost. I'm going to spend all 8 of my treasure to purchase that asset. So that is going to take the King's Word down to nothing as they are spending their money on this stuff. And I think that looking at our goal here of spending money on bribes and influence, I think because the Kingsword Criers and the Royal Dispatch Company are about gathering information and news and then disseminating that out to the populace, I think the manufacturer here is not necessarily a physical, like they're creating goods, but it is the actual act of like creating and compiling news and giving it out. They don't just do the criers on the sides of the street. They also run theaters throughout Heartvale where they are presenting very carefully crafted works of art in ways to influence the population one way or the other on certain issues. So I am going to mark down that I have spent 8 wealth on that because I think that will increase their influence. Having this manufactory, I think they're paying for basically artisans and like writers and creatives who are coming in and now working for them and generating these works of art and artistry that can then be disseminated out to the populace. So that is going to tap them out for treasure on this turn, but they have a pretty powerful asset that they can use next turn. And I'm not going to roll on that quite yet. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and look over at my trade company because it says as a free action, once per turn, the owner of the asset may roll 1d4 damage against oneself done to the asset in exchange for earning 1d6 minus 1 treasure points. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So a trade company has 15 hit points. So I'm going to roll 1d4. I rolled a 2. So that is going to take their hit points down to 13. And now I'm going to roll a d6 and subtract that by 1. And that's going to give me some treasure points. So 3 on the die minus 1 is 2. So that's going to give me 2 treasure to play with. And because of that, and because I have purchased that asset, I am going to go ahead and roll a d6 and see if I gain any more treasure. I rolled a 6, so I get 2 points of treasure. So that's actually going to take the Kingsword Criers up to 4 treasure. So they spent a bunch of money to hire some new artists, and pretty quickly that is turning around and that investment is paying off. That is going to bring their faction turn to a close, and we're now left with the Shade and Lord DeSoto's faction of the Council of 12. I don't know who should go first, so I'm going to go ahead and roll a d6. And 1, 2, or 3 will be the Shade. 4, 5, or 6 will be Lord DeSoto. It's a 5, so Lord DeSoto is going to go first. So he has a wealth of 6 and a combined cunning and force of 8. And so that is going to give him 8 treasure as well. So he's starting off with 8 treasure. Now, his assets are hired friends. This is as a free action once per turn. The faction may spend 1 treasure and grant a wealth asset within 1 turn's movement range, the subtle quality. This quality will remain regardless of the wealth asset's movement until the hired friends are destroyed or they use this ability again. We've got a Vanguard unit, which is basically like a military unit that can move other assets pretty quickly. We have a Merchant Prince, and this represents Lord DeSoto. So Merchant Prince can be triggered as a free action once per turn before buying a new asset in the same location. The Merchant Prince takes 1d4 damage and the purchased asset costs 1d8 treasure less, down to a minimum of half of its normal price. And then we also have armed guards, and all of these assets are located at the Duxit, which is where the base of influence that Lord DeSoto's faction has, except for the armed guards, because those were in the South Scales. Because I had this idea going into this first faction turn that we are following the events of the estate pretty quickly here. And so DeSoto has sent his personal bodyguards into the South Scales to hunt down the people who murdered his nephew. Because I think he is pretty torn up about this circumstance, even though others have argued, probably Lady von Triken, the Red Fox being foremost among them, that whatever happened there, Defara was acting incredibly unusual, and whatever sort of magical transformation he underwent was not normal, and the crest cannot be held responsible for fighting back against this assault on them. I think DeSoto, in his grief, is driven to get revenge on those who killed his nephew. Even if he accepts that the crest as a whole have no overall guilt in this, he still wants to see the people who hurt his nephew, specifically the person who put a blade through his nephew's back brought to justice or killed. So I had placed these armed guards in the South Scales, which is where the Crow's Nest, the Crest's base of influence, is located, because I had this idea that they were going to attack the Crest and, try to take out those people. But because the Crest got to act first and was able to stealth their infantry, I'm sort of starting to second guess that idea. So let's go ahead and take a look at our actions again. So we can just flat out attack, and this would be an attack by those armed guards against the Crest in general. And we could use the infantry to fight back. We wouldn't necessarily have to. Or we could move some assets around. We could expand influence. We could also create an asset, hide an asset, or sell an asset. I think there's a lot of maneuvering that's going on here. And because the Crest were able to successfully hide their infantry before these armed guards arrived in the district, I'm going to go ahead and create an asset for Lord DeSoto. And this is going to represent him searching for those people in this area. And I think this probably is going to be informers. So he knows that they're around here. He is going to pay some coin, and that amount of coin is going to be 2 in order to gather up some informers in the area. So that's going to take his treasure down to 6, and he has purchased informers in that district. And I think next faction turn, he's going to be able to use those informers to try and suss out if and where the Crest are located. So that is going to be it for Lord DeSoto's faction, as he has started spreading some money around and is gathering up informants to try and suss out where the hidden Crest are located. That brings us to the final faction in this faction turn, which is the Shade. So they have 2 assets, which is Vigilant Agents. A constant flow of observations runs back to the faction from these watchful counterintelligence agents. Whenever another faction moves a stealth asset into a location within 1 move's distance from the Vigilant Agents, they may make a cunning versus cunning attack against the owning faction. On a success, the intruding asset loses its stealth after it completes the move. So they can basically keep an eye on stealth units and keep them from moving into the surrounding areas. They also have an arcane laboratory, and this ties into what makes the von Triken family special, as they have this magical vault that is located somewhere at the estate, and this vault is locked by blood, and only a member of the von Triken family, only a member of the family who has some blood relation can access this vault. And I think this arcane laboratory is tied to that as well. So the faction's overall magic is counted as 1 step higher for the purposes of creating assets in the same location as the laboratory, and multiple arcane laboratories in the same location can increase the magic boost by multiple steps. So the Shade already have medium magic rating because of the Red Fox being one of the most powerful sorceresses in the city, as well as this sort of blood-locked vault that contains the multitude of secrets in the city of Heartvale. And their faction goal is actually to root out the enemy, and this is the Vidala family. because I think the Red Fox is concerned now about Lord DeSoto and the Crest and these events that have happened. But I think that her focus, her goal is always to hunt down the Vidala, because they're the ones that kicked all this off by smuggling in those artifacts, including the Eye of Vargosh, which the Crest managed to steal from the Defara estate before Lord Defara unleashed whatever magical power he did. Now, I think she, much like Lephalia, has some sense of what Lord Defara was, but I don't know that we need to get into that right now in this particular faction turn. So she wants to find the Vidala. She wants to root out the enemy. And rooting out the enemy involves destroying a base of influence of a rival faction in a specific location. So I think she needs to find where the Vidala have gone. And so I think she's probably also going to create an asset. And what is that asset going to be? I'm tempted to do something like Petty Seers, which is a cadre of skilled fortune tellers and minor oracles that have been enlisted by the faction to foresee perils and allow swift counterattacks. Or I could do something like Occult Infiltrators. And Occult Infiltrators are magically gifted spies and assassins enlisted to serve the faction. The Occult Infiltrator asset always begins play with the stealth quality. I think it's gotta have to be Seers. I think the Red Fox is bringing in whatever mages she can to try and get a sense of where the Vidala have gone. Already, Admiral Welfrin of the Vexillio War College has been sent to hunt down the Vidala, and I think she needs more than that. But maybe that's the asset that she can gain. I'm going to stick with the Seers, because I think that makes the most sense. I guess I've forgotten myself here. I should start off with giving the Shade some treasure to spend. So the wealth is going to be a 3, and then the force and cunning combined are a 6. And again, that's going to be 1 and change, so that's going to be 2 plus 3 is 5 treasure to start out. And then those Petty Seers are going to cost 2 treasure. So that's going to take her treasure down to 3. And we are going to put a note in here that we have Petty Seers. And I think this is going to allow her to get a sense of where the Vidala are located. And then she's going to be able to start to take action, whether that's sending assassins or, whatever, after the Vidala in Davenar. So the Shade now have Petty Seers in their employ, and that is all that they can do. So a lot of this faction turn has been maneuvering and getting ready. But I think the thing that we have learned is that, especially influencing the Crest and Benn's adventures, is that there are people hunting for